Let's turn to our study in the book of Romans. Let's turn to Romans 14, Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food. Oh my. We left off last week with a quote from Tim Hegg from his Romans commentary, and we're talking about Romans 14 and the issues surrounding table fellowship in Paul's day and how this is relevant for us today. Let's just jump right into, I'm going to back up and read Tim Hegg's Romans commentary quote from my that I pulled into my commentary, which is available at my own website at tetzetorah.com. That's TETZETORAH.com. Love to have you hop on over to my website and take a look around as well. But this is a definition that this is a commentary that I put together on Romans 14 entitled Romans 14 Unplugged, Feasts and Fasts and Food, oh my. Here's what Tim Hegg has to say. We're interacting with a part of Paul's letter in Romans where he says, it's true, I'm paraphrasing, it's true, everything is clean. But for those people who consider it not clean, then, for them it's unclean, and all things are clean, but it's wrong for anyone to use food to judge his brother. And so it's within that context of Paul's words about talking about nothing is unclean in of itself, like he said way up in verse 19, and then in 20, it's true that all things are clean. And the reason we're talking about this is because by today's modern Christian interpretation, there are differences of opinion as to whether Paul is uprooting Torah commandments and he's actually giving us Christians the license to disregard what God considers clean and unclean animals from the Levitical perspective. If Paul says that nothing is unclean in of itself, and then he comes right around and says, it's true, all things are clean, then does this mean we don't have to keep clean and unclean according to Torah anymore? Has the New Testament replaced the Old Testament definitions of clean and unclean? Has Paul just wiped out God's definitions? That's really the question on the table, pun intended. Here's what Tim Hegg has to say. The definition of clean and unclean, we're talking about English, by the way, it comes from the Torah, not from man. Obviously, we're talking about English words when we say clean and unclean. I haven't even gotten to the Hebrew or the Greek yet. But keep in mind that when we see English in our Bibles, it evokes a certain definition that we have in our mind. So regardless of what Hebrew or Greek word lies underneath our English, if we see in our Bible where it says clean and unclean in one part of our Bible, like say Leviticus, and we read those same words, clean and unclean, in English in the New Testament, it's easy to assume that they are talking about the same definitions. But unfortunately, translators aren't always consistent. I'm not faulting them. I'm simply saying this is the reality that we live with when we're talking about translations. We have bias built into the translation. It's impossible to get away from it. So a translator decides whether he thinks that those words should match up from Old Testament to New Testament. Unfortunately, they don't always do so. It'd be better if they did, but they don't. That's why we have to do our homework and go back on our own and figure out what original word is underneath this English, and does it match up with something that was said earlier. Tim Hegg continues, therefore, any meat declared edible by God should not be ruled unclean by man. The generic point that Tim Hegg's trying to bring up that's relevant for us today from 21st century perspective is that if God says it's permissible, the animal, then we can derive meat products from that permissible animal, and generally speaking, we're within the boundaries of keeping the commandments of God. No person should be allowed to come along after God's commandment and point at an animal and say, you can't eat that because of XYZ. He says it's on this basis, the fact that God declares food clean and unclean, and man comes along and changes things. It's on this basis that Paul himself emphatically declares that nothing is unclean in and of itself. What Paul has to help differentiate to his Roman crowd is that God says this is clean or unclean, but now man can come along and add extra definitions to suit his furthering explanation of what he may or may not deem as permissible. In general cases, there's nothing really wrong with that. Everybody has their own food requirements and needs and things like that. So let's keep looking at this. Tim Hanks says, that is, if God has declared it clean, some animal or some food, and therefore edible, then generally speaking, it should not be otherwise considered. So Hegg says that this viewpoint is correct will be seen in verse 20, where Paul actually includes the word food. So we know he's not just saying all things are clean, all things are unclean. He's not talking about everything in general. It is a discussion on food. And then Hegg quotes verse 20, quote, "Do not tear down the work of God for the sake of food. All things indeed are clean." I think the best way to understand that word clean there is to assign the definition, the nuance of innocent, that is unspoken for until a man or someone, even God, comes along and declares it otherwise. And even then, he's not talking about all things. When he says all things are clean, he doesn't mean everything that you encounter is clean. This is obviously not the case. So we can't get hyper literal from our English or even the Greek when Paul says all things are clean. Obviously, idolatry is unclean. Idolatry defiles you. Sin itself is not clean. Pornography is not clean. Adultery is not clean. Stealing is not clean. Murder is not clean. There are any number of items or things that exist in the world today that are not clean. I don't really have to explain that to a Christian, do I? Paul doesn't mean everything's clean. It's the context of food that he's talking about when he says all things are clean. All food items are the things that he means, are indeed innocent. And even still, we have to massage this word clean. Taken in its hyper-literal form from the English, Paul isn't saying that, hey, see that pig over there? It's food. It's clean. Eat it. See that shellfish over there? See that shrimp? See that lobster? See that clam? See that oyster? See that octopus? See that squid? It's clean. That is not really what Paul is saying. We'll get to that here in a second. He concludes by reminding us that Paul's point must be that everything that qualifies as food, i.e. everything that God permits to be eaten, is clean. So the list of clean and unclean is defined by God. Which animals are permissible, which animals are prohibited. God sets the standard. Let's pick up my commentary. Again, just to be absolutely clear, this is me talking, I maintain that sha'ul is not teaching us. He's not teaching us that the dietary list of Leviticus 11 has been discarded. This is an incorrect hermeneutic or interpretive lens by which to view and read your Bible. Messianic Judaism, of which I am a part, comes along, accepts the New Testament as authoritative, but at the same time maintains their acceptance of Moshe as authoritative. And that's where I think Paul's going to be found as well. As an author, he's a Messianic Jew. He believes in the truth of Moses, that it is established, that it's not uprooted, that it's not been done away with. Paul does not teach that the law has been abrogated. But what Paul does do is bring in the truths of the apostolic scriptures that he's giving people, what we would later call the New Testament, and helping us to understand how we can walk this out, not under our own power, but under the power of the Holy Spirit inside of us. Here's what I have to say. In fact, going off of this idea that Paul didn't teach a law-free gospel. In fact, sha'ul, Paul's name in Hebrew, sha'ul is really reiterating what his own teacher, the master, Yeshua, taught him. What is it? All is clean. What do we mean? All is clean. All food that God says is permissible as food is clean in and of itself. And to suggest that Paul is disagreeing with Moses, who would of course be speaking for God, or to say that Paul's disagreeing with Yeshua, who would obviously agree with Moses, who of course is agreeing with God, if we believe that Paul breaks that chain of interpretation from God to Moses to Jesus to Paul, if Paul makes a break and suddenly comes up with his own definitions for the sake of Gentile Christianity, well then we've done a disservice to ourselves and to Paul and to Yeshua and to Moses and to God himself. Okay, so the master taught Paul that all is clean. That is, until a man comes along and declares it otherwise. Now, again, this word clean in the English is what's going to trip us up. or unclean. In the Hebrew, we have a definition that's supplied by God, applied to a certain food item or an animal. This food is unclean because the animal that it derives from is unclean. Therefore, Israel, it's unclean. By the time we get to the New Testament, we still have the same underlying Hebrew definitions of animals and food, but we have an extra man's definition, the word unclean in the English, but it's a different Greek word that's not trying to convey the same thing as unclean in the Hebrew. Instead, the Greek word used for unclean, that's very common in the New Testament, the word koinos, doesn't reflect the intrinsic nature of the animal that God defined. Instead, it's a man's way of coming along and saying the animal itself is still unclean, but the food that's derived from that animal is common. It's unsanctified. It's been handled by too many people. It's been touched by everybody, and therefore it's if anything, it's just contaminated. In the regards of the food, the underlying food is safe if it weren't contaminated by outside contact with too many elements. I say in my commentary, in the end, and we're speaking of within the context of arguing over particular items, in the end, it's our petty differences and pride that eventually divides us. Paul doesn't want Jews and Gentiles, slaves and free, male and female. He doesn't want them fighting over the external differences that we have with one another, those external differences including the way that we understand foodstuffs. Let me continue my commentary and then I'll close out this part tonight. Food, I say food, simply becomes the innocent, and I'm playing with the word innocent there because the Greek word katharos, translated as into English as clean, when Paul says true, all things are clean, the Greek word is katharos, and one of the nuances of that Greek word is innocent, meaning until someone comes along and declares it otherwise, the food in and of itself is an innocent partaker of the situation. I'm not talking about bringing in the intrinsic definition of the animal that God assigned. That's not what I mean by innocent. I'm talking about the man-made definition that comes along and says this is either clean or unclean. That's what I mean by innocent. So food is the innocent medium that we humans fight about, right? The food fight that breaks out between us, pun intended there. In closing, I say, Sha'ul states that food should not be the point of contention. He says it this way. He says that don't destroy with food. Don't destroy for the sake of food your brother. I'm really butchering that. Don't destroy your brother, the one for whom Christ died, for the sake of food, or something to that effect. Don't use food as the weapon to destroy what is otherwise a precious person in God's sight. Food is important, but it's not the go-all, everything, end-all, be-all, do-all. It's not the most important thing. Keeping the commandments of God is important. Don't get me wrong. I don't believe we should do away with the Torah in order to simply appease our brother. We uphold Torah, we strengthen Torah, we establish Torah, but at the same time, we don't use the Torah and our understanding of food and the commandments of God as weapons. We are Torah keepers, not Torah terrorists, okay? Sha'ul states that food should not be the point of contention. And I say in my commentary that this sounds amazingly like Sha'ul's instructions to Timothy in his first letter. And I'm going to stop right here because we're out of time for this segment 1. We'll pick this up next week. We'll pull this quote from the book of Timothy and see how this fits in with the theology of what Paul's trying to convey to us.